Okay, great. So I think we have a little bit less than 30 minutes for discussion. So I think you guys raised some very interesting, very interesting ideas. I hadn't heard monopoly mining as a term formulated before, so nice work, David. I think you coined something. So why don't we go ahead and start with questions from the audience. So I want to give the audience a chance to ask all the questions they might have wanted to. Yeah.
Hi, so my question is actually about the last talk where you mentioned proof of stake and its centralization issues. My question is really that if you're designing any consensus, Sybil resistant consensus algorithm based on proof of some resource, that resource can always be bought by money, right? And I would say that wealth inequality in general, even though serious, is probably less than inequality in a particular good that can be bought by money, like inequality in I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's entirely possible, and I don't mean to imply that proof of work is somehow inherently decentralized. I think it's unclear that it is as directly purchasable because, for example, the availability of cheap power isn't usually cheap power is not kind of a purchasable good. It's a side effect of for example, a nation state investing in its own power resources for more traditional usage, and then you have this side effect where it occasionally has cheap power available. And if you play it out to the extreme, you might imagine that nation state kind of using its own cheap power, using that side effect to go ahead and mine Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So you might imagine a world where that is more decentralized than just necessarily directly money.
Yeah, but then the other thing is a proof of stake isn't just money, right? It's the money you specifically put in buying the stake. And if you look at, for example, let's say the market caps of the S&P 500, yeah, it is obviously very centralized in the sense that it is centralized in a very small proportion of the population. But if you make a pie chart, it's still like your pie chart of that really fragmented pie chart. Like if you put wealth,
right? Sure,
chart,
but you only care about the bottom third, right? You care about the most centralized third. And ultimately, I think the question is that most centralized third? I don't mean to imply that that's going to be like one entity, but the question is that most centralized third going to be more or fewer entities than, for example, the Libra Foundation, right? And I think there is very, very good reason to believe that it's going to be fewer. And if it's fewer, we should stick with the thing that's more clear, more upfront, and has more contracts backing it than something that's a little more opaque. And again, I don't mean to imply that proof of work is inherently better. I think the jury is more still out on proof of work, and hopefully there's more research there.
Hi. It's hard to pick who I want to direct the question at, because I had some for each of you. But for Matt, in my understanding, was it Matt?
We're both Matt.
Oh my God, that's for the middle Matt.
Middle Matt, all right.
I know that you abstracted out the latency issue, but that's the one I'm the most interested in. And I was wondering if you'd thought about it, because from my understanding, selfish mining becomes much more feasible if you can get sort of a front run on blocks moving to other people.
Good. So the what I did not cover in the talk was some details about selfish mining. So what you said is absolutely correct. So if you have a extremely well-connected miner who can broadcast their blocks faster than anyone else, then selfish mining is even better than what I said. It can be profitable no matter how small you are. And I guess what I would say in response is that the way that they chose to model that in their paper, I think was the right decision, where they just said, here's one number, and this says if you broadcast a block in response to hearing about a block from someone else, what is the probability that your block makes it to someone else faster? And then they said as a function of that parameter, they did their analysis. So if this parameter is 1, if you always win, then selfish mining is really good. And if you always lose, then you get the 1/3 number. And so what I would say is that what I liked about their choice was to just say, here's one number, and forget about the fact that latency is different at different times. Forget about the fact that it might be different to different people. Let's just try and boil it down to like one number and say that that's roughly capturing the important stuff. So Yeah, so I guess I was maybe a little bit sloppy with language to say that completely forget about latency, but I guess what I meant was I really like that they chose to way oversimplify what's actually happening in practice, but boil it down to as mathematically simple as possible, but still getting the main ideas out.
Okay, so Robert, yes, I would, no, David, yeah. So I would like to know, you didn't explain the counterattack. That was quite interesting. I didn't know how you said there would be hardware and you could launch a counterattack.
Yeah, are you familiar with
if I
NICE?
may, excuse me, if I may have a second question, but I'll ask it after you've answered.
Yeah. So are you familiar with NICE Hash? For people in the room, NICE Hash is a hash rate marketplace, essentially, where you can go and rent not any number, but a large number of GPUs, large enough to 51% attack a number of cryptocurrencies. And so if you're operating in a fluid marketplace where hash rate can be purchased, then you have this like liquid response to a hash rate attack. Now, on something like Bitcoin, no such market exists. I also don't think that such a market ever would exist for a large number of secondary reasons. It's just, if you have a mining farm, it's a bad idea to loan your hash rate out. But that was kind of what I meant when I was saying counterattack. So I think in the Bitcoin model, counterattack is probably not a realistic defense.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, so as far as I understand, if you do selfish mining, you can reverse transactions. So you would like have a really large payment. You pay someone millions of dollars, then you have lots of hash rate and you reverse that transaction as if it never happened, and you've received all the services or the car or the Ferrari or whatever you bought. Okay, so if you were to limit the amount of the transactions to tiny amounts, that would sort of negate selfish mining.
So that's not what selfish mining is. That's just a double spend attack. But if you were to limit on chain the amount of money that people could spend, I think they would find creative ways around that limit. Is my guess what would happen.
I just also wanted to say on the counterattack topic, we actually modeled out this game, and I think under certain circumstances, counterattacking is a feasible strategy, which leads to an equilibrium where it might not be the case that anyone would conduct an attack in the first place, which I think is really interesting. But I actually have a question that I want to pose to all of you, which is, if we think about that, if we think about the fact that maybe counterattacking is a possibility, or you might have something like a monopoly miner, then how do you think about the question of how much hash rate is enough? Do you think that the amount of hash rate necessary to secure these things really needs to be proportional or on the order of the value of the market cap of the currency? Because that sort of puts a ceiling, I think, on how big it can grow.
Yeah, so non-rigorously, I would say that I think it actually does need to be pretty high. Because if we go to the extreme of imagining that you just need, to spend $100 on an AWS cluster to do an attack, this whole like counterattacking thing, I would say that like an attack, counterattack, that whole game introduces a lot of friction and potentially anxiety is maybe a word, to the system. And you really want to make sure that you have the game as a defense. But like at some point, it becomes interesting to attack a system just for arson. Like you just want to trigger the game because you think it'll be funny. And so we want to make sure that the cost of attack is high enough that there's a lot at stake. And someone who's going to test the system has to pay money to test it unsuccessfully, because we don't want them to find out that the system is broken, right?
My intuition is not good enough to answer on the spot, but.
Yeah, I think that's mine too. Obviously, in the kind of academically, game theoretically rigorous direction, if you kind of go down that route, I think the answer is yes. That you need a hash rate proportional to the amount of money that's transacted within the system, and what that proportion is very unclear. But you need this kind of weird proportion. But in a more practical sense, it is the amount of untrusted payments that are occurring, right? If you have the vast majority of kind of value of Bitcoin payments is pretty clearly like exchange arbitrage that's just going between two exchanges, between, you know, a KYC'd entity to another KYC'd entity, between two large businesses in the US. Okay, if they go and spend a bunch of money and double spend this, that's maybe not all that interesting. It's also not really a practically interesting use case of Bitcoin, but it is a large portion of the actual volume. And so I think you have to discount that volume to some extent. How you do that, no idea.
Yeah, so this is mostly a question for David, but I think there was sort of some reference to it in Matt Corallo's talk as well. But I asked to direct it to David because I think you have a unique perspective on this. How do you think about the, in terms of where Bitcoin or any crypto asset ultimately connects to real world value and contracts and assets like fiat currencies that derive their value from the coercive power of government, where does the value connect? How do you think about framing the security model in terms of connecting back to assets that are protected by contracts enforced by governments rather than anything else?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. But I think so. Things like Bitcoin give us the ability to interact with untrusted counterparties in ways we couldn't do previously. For example, like PayPal shuts down accounts, monitors transactions. Like if you're two small nation states in Africa trying to transact with each other, you may not have a good way to do that except to, you know, abide by all the bylaws that France wants to hand you. This is a real world example. Whereas if they start using something like Bitcoin, they can sort of, you know, reject the extra governance that France is asserting over these countries. And so I think the value of blockchains comes from the ability to sort of, you know, command your own sovereignty, and you decide what rules you abide by, as opposed to your financial provider deciding what rules you abide by. And I think that's super empowering. That's why. So I think I would disagree with Matt that a monopoly miner is worse than a Libra situation, because I think that I conjecture that we can build systems under a monopoly miner where the consensus group, which is of one, the consensus group of one person, is actually still unable to tell you what to do or put restrictions on how you act. And so I think that's where, you know, when Bitcoin hits $10,000, that's where a lot of the value is coming from, is that independence that you get from any other financial system.
Do you have a response?
Not me.
I think maybe one assumption I make that maybe I should have elucidated a little better, or maybe should have elucidated at all, was that I think in the short term, this is absolutely true that a kind of monopoly or small group of entities working in this weird model of proof of work or even proof of stake can withstand that kind of regulatory oversight. Because regulators aren't really sure what's going on, they don't want to stomp on it, blah, blah, blah. There's various reasons why that kind of regulation hasn't appeared. But I think in the long term, regulators are not stupid. They eventually wake up to the realities of the system and eventually realize, like, this is how the system actually works. Eventually get past the phase of we don't want to hamper the growth of something that's potentially transformative and get to the phase of, okay, people are using this and we want to have some impact on the direction of the broader world economy. That is literally their position. That's their job. And then can take action, right? And so then you look at kind of a monopoly miner or a stake association or what have you, and kind of in the long term, regulators wake up to the reality of it and are willing to take action on that basis. And at that point, then you kind of lose that property. How long that takes, I'm not the right person to even speculate, but
So this question might be best for David, but feel free anyone else to chime in. So if you can let go of kind of like the decentralization assumption on mining, are there other assumptions that you've thought of letting go of, say like a global consensus set enforced through, sunk economic cost or,
Yes. So I think probably the most salient departure that I have from most Bitcoin core devs is I would say I anticipate the future to have large numbers of blockchains. So like, tens of trillions, maybe even like more than one per human being. And I expect most of them to be like completely machine operated and like, none of them have names other than the hash of their Genesis block. And so that turns a lot of things upside down. And I think it's a very interesting way to look. And so I wouldn't nominate any, of the blockchains that exist today, I think Bitcoin is by far the best. But I also think that if you give it 20 years, we will see sort of multi-chain systems pop up that feel superior to single chain systems. And then that also makes regulatory oversight more challenging because they can target any big miner. But as soon as you squish one thing, everybody just kind of disperses to the other ones. So you get a more resilient, in each component is more fragile, but as a whole, as long as they're super fluid, it's like trying to beat up water would be the hope.
I actually have a question for Matt Weinberg, so I'm gonna ask that really quick. At the very beginning, Dahlia asked you about considering the value of the token endogenously, right? And you told her that was not a good question for the EC community, whereas that seems like the value of the token going to zero. That seems like a great question for the EC community. So at least from my knowledge of the distributed computing community, we don't have a way to value a token going to zero that I know of. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you say that and how we might model pricing changes.
Sure. So I guess my impression, and I guess you or Dahlia or someone should correct me if I'm wrong, was that it was already something that the distributed computing community was able to reason about was to put, say the attack succeeds or does not succeed, and there's a dollar amount on if the attack succeeds, you get some number of dollars for succeeding, and then you can reason about how many dollars do you need to secure your system or make it unprofitable to attack or something. And I would just say my initial vibe on that is that yes, there's money involved, and so that makes it sound maybe like the kind of question I would be good at answering, but I don't actually think that the tools I have would be better at answering a question like that. I would say that the stuff that I feel like the EC community or the mechanism design tools are good for reasoning about are sort of like what you might think of as like the nickel and dime stuff. So like stuff where there's a smooth transition from if I selfish mine a little bit more, I'm going to hurt the currency a little bit more because it's going to be a little bit more obvious. And as this like smooth trade-off happens, is there any range in which it's profitable or not? Whereas I feel like the currency plummeting to zero feels like a very binary event. And I feel like that's it's more like a techniques thing. It's not like does it fit within the scope of dealing with incentives and algorithms. It's more of a techniques thing that most of the techniques we have I don't think are well suited to address like binary events and stuff like that, if that makes sense.
Can I ask a follow-up question? How much modeling has occurred in the cryptocurrency kind of research area of detection probability? Has anyone spent any real time are you aware of any work in that area?
So just to clarify the question, you mean someone trying to do an empirical study of is there selfish mining going on this currency, for instance?
More what the assuming a certain detection probability curve.
Like, is it profitable or not? Yeah, so I mean, I'm not aware of any published works. I worked on one project with an undergrad to get started towards this, but it's not a publication or close to that level. I would just say I have a model in mind. That's what I would try, and I don't know what the answers were turned into. I would say my instinct though is that it should remain profitable for like reasonable, whatever is likely true in practice. But I still think there are other things that matter, such as, are you really going to go out of your way to learn exactly how to selfish mine if it's going to increase your profits by 0.001% or something like that? I understand that the model doesn't capture everything, but my guess is that if you really want to go all the way down to like the nickels and dimes, that it probably should still be profitable. Yeah.
I have sort of a two-part question. So the first part is sort of there's this assumption of the monopoly miner that you guys have been talking about a bit. Do you see that as an effect of how sort of early and sort of immature the industry is, especially as it relates to mining, and how few participants there are in the sort of different layers of the supply chain? And then the second part is like, you guys have proposed a lot of sort of technical solutions to sort of make mining a little bit more decentralized, but have you looked into or even researched yourselves sort of business model solutions that could help realign incentives?
Yeah. So the first one, I definitely would say that things are pretty immature. Like even the electricity industry, I think that Bitcoin hits it. Like right now, most electricity is kind of niche, one-off deals. At some point, we hit a scale where we've consumed them all. I don't know at that point. That point might be more than an order of magnitude away from where we are today. But
specifically, you're saying the electricity industry as it relates to mining.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Specifically that. And so we might get to a point where economies of scale at electricity make sense again. We might not. We might find that one-off deals actually have amazing depth. And similar with a lot of the manufacturing, like basically we've been piggybacking entirely off of the CPU industry, which is like we use manufacturers that make general purpose chips. We've never built a foundry that the whole foundry is dedicated to like mining. And I think that when you look at the physics of it, I think such a foundry would actually be heavily competitive. And like if we move that direction, again, we don't know what would happen there. So I do think it's really early. And then from a business model perspective, we really tried to get Obelisk to have a successful business model. The things that we tried didn't work. I would say it didn't go precisely where we wanted it to. That doesn't mean that there's not some other thing that we didn't try. But yeah, so far I don't think that we have an idea of a business model that could fix mining at the moment.
Well, I think specifically the business models around how you achieve cheap power, I think, has been played with to some extent. It is all one-off deals, so to some extent that's already a little specific per deal. But in terms of like finding or somehow creating devices that are able to withstand the high kind of toggle, not semiconductor toggle, but device toggle rate of interruptible power. You look at like, again, the Belarusian president's comments, which to some extent were hilarious, but to some extent represent a reality of like, no one has a bunch of ASIC power sitting out back behind a nuclear energy plant because sometimes there's excess power there, right? So there are business models in that vein that I think haven't been explored sufficiently.
I think unfortunately we are